The Duke had not expected to fall to his knees in a graveyard, certainly not because of a child's voice. But on that cold morning, with frost still clinging to the edges of black marble, a single sentence spoken by someone who had no right to know it would undo 18 months of perfectly controlled grief. He had buried his daughter on a Sunday, and he remembered the day with a clarity that felt almost offensive now. The sky had been a soft, forgiving gray, the kind that suggested the world might at least attempt to share in a man's loss. And yet nothing about the day had truly matched the enormity of what had been taken from him. There had been no thunder, no storm, no dramatic fracture in the heavens, just the quiet, relentless sound of soil meeting polished wood, and the Duke of Halvern, standing beside the grave with a posture so rigid that even his closest staff could not tell whether he was breathing or simply performing the act of being alive out of long-practiced obligation. He had not cried, not then, not later, not even in the long, echoing nights that followed, because grief, as he understood it, was a private failure of control, and he had spent an entire lifetime ensuring he did not fail at anything that could be mastered through discipline. Instead, he had folded the loss into himself like a document filed away in the deepest drawer, acknowledged, categorized, and never to be examined without necessity. For 18 months, he visited her grave every week at precisely the same hour, walking the same gravel path through the churchyard, pausing at the same wrought iron gate, and standing before the same headstone carved with a name that still felt like it belonged to someone who might answer if called loudly enough. He told himself it was duty that brought him there, not love, because love implied a softness he had never permitted himself, and duty was something he understood. Duty was clean, structured, survivable. The churchyard of St. Bartholomew's was, by most measures, an unremarkable place, bordered by ancient yews that had witnessed more endings than any living person could comprehend, their branches stretching like dark, patient hands over rows of stone that varied in age and grandeur, but shared the same quiet finality. And it suited him precisely because it asked nothing of him beyond presence. No one disturbed him there. No one spoke unless spoken to, and the silence had become the closest thing to peace he allowed himself. That was why, on this particular morning, the sound of laughter struck him as something almost indecent, a bright, unfiltered sound that did not belong among the dead, and he stopped mid-step, his cane pressing slightly deeper into the gravel as he listened, not out of curiosity, but out of a growing, unfamiliar irritation that someone had failed to observe the unspoken rules of this place. The voices were small, unmistakably young, carrying a kind of fearless curiosity that had not yet learned to moderate itself in the presence of loss. And as they came closer, weaving between the headstones with the careless confidence of children who see not endings but shapes in stories, the Duke felt something tighten in his chest. Not quite anger, not quite discomfort, but a resistance to the intrusion of life into a space he had carefully preserved as untouched by it. They appeared from behind a row of older stones, two figures bundled against the cold in mismatched coats that had clearly seen more than one season, a girl slightly ahead, gesturing animatedly as she narrated her discoveries, and a boy trailing just behind, quieter, more observant, his gaze moving not just across the stones but through them, as if he were trying to understand something larger than their size or shape. The girl stopped abruptly in front of the black marble headstone, her small boots leaving faint impressions in the frost, and tilted her head upward, studying the carved lettering with an intensity that might have been comical if it had not been directed at something so personal. She must have been very important, she declared with complete certainty, her voice carrying in the still air, and the Duke felt the words land with a strange, disorienting force, not because they were incorrect, but because they were spoken without reverence, without the careful distance that adults used when referring to the dead, as if importance were simply an observable fact rather than a fragile, loaded truth. The boy stepped closer, his expression more serious, and for a brief, suspended moment, the Duke found himself watching him in a way he did not fully understand, noting the particular set of his features, the quiet deliberation in his movements, the way he seemed to consider before speaking, and then the boy said softly, almost to himself, "She looks kind." And something in the Duke's carefully ordered world shifted, just slightly, just enough to be noticed, because that, of all things, was not written on the stone, not recorded in any official account, not something the world at large had ever cared to preserve. And yet it was true in a way that made his throat tighten with a sensation he had not permitted himself to feel since the day she died. He told himself it was coincidence, that children said things without understanding their weight, that there was nothing in this moment that required his attention, and he very nearly turned away, very nearly resumed his measured walk and left the intrusion behind him, when a woman's voice entered the space, calm and steady, calling the children back with the gentle authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed not through fear, but through trust. She stepped into view a second later, brushing a strand of dark hair back beneath a simple hat, her coat practical rather than fashionable, her posture composed in a way that suggested resilience rather than ease, and she did not notice him at first, her focus entirely on the children as she approached, her expression softening just slightly when she saw where they had stopped. "We don't climb on the stones," she said, not unkindly, and the boy nodded at once, stepping back, while the girl reached into her pocket and produced a small, slightly wilted flower, holding it up as if seeking approval before placing it carefully at the base of the headstone. The Duke watched this with an attention that felt disproportionate to the action, aware of a subtle shift within himself that he could neither name nor dismiss, and he might have remained only an observer if not for the sudden misstep that followed. The girl's foot slipping on the frost, her balance faltering just enough to send her down onto one knee with a small, startled cry that carried more surprise than pain. The woman was beside her instantly, kneeling without hesitation, her gloved hands gentle but efficient as she examined the child's palm, and the Duke found himself watching not the fall, not the injury, but the way the woman responded, without panic, without fuss, with a quiet assurance that seemed to steady the air around them. "Look at me," she said softly, guiding the girl's attention away from the scrape, and then, almost absent-mindedly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, she added, "It's all well now, little one." The words struck him with the force of something physical, something undeniable, and in that instant, the carefully constructed distance he had maintained for 18 months collapsed entirely, because those were her words, his daughter's words, spoken in that exact tone, with that exact certainty, a phrase she had used since childhood in moments of fear or hurt, a phrase no one else had ever adopted, no one else had ever needed to. And as the realization took hold, the Duke of Halvern felt his knees give way beneath him, his hand reaching blindly for the cold edge of a nearby stone as the world tilted, not metaphorically but entirely, the breath leaving him in a sharp, involuntary exhale as one impossible thought formed with terrifying clarity. How could a stranger speak with the voice of the dead? The Duke didn't remember choosing to step forward, only that the silence after those words had become unbearable, and something inside him refused to let it pass unanswered. "Where did you hear that?" he demanded, his voice rough, unfamiliar even to himself. The woman looked up, surprised now that she fully registered him, but she didn't retreat. She stood slowly, brushing frost from her gloves, her expression calm but searching. "I've always said it," she replied. "It comforts children." She rested a hand on the girl's shoulder, steady and warm. But the Duke shook his head immediately, sharper this time. "No, not like that. Not those words." His breath came heavier now. "No one says it like that." A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, subtle but real. "I don't remember learning it," she admitted. "It's just something I've always known." That answer unsettled him more than any explanation could have. There was no performance in her voice, no attempt to convince, just quiet honesty. He turned away from her then, his eyes falling back to the headstone, to the name he had trained himself to look at without feeling. But now the control was slipping, piece by piece. The boy stepped closer, more cautious this time. "Did you know her?" he asked gently. The Duke hesitated, the old instinct to deflect rising, but it failed him. "She was my daughter," he said. The words felt heavier than they should have, like something long buried being forced back into the light. The girl tilted her head, studying the grave again. "She sounds nice," she said simply. And something in him cracked. Not loudly, not completely, but enough. "She was," he replied, quieter now. The woman watched closely, her composure softening into something more attentive. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know." "It wouldn't have changed anything," the Duke answered, almost absently. Then, after a pause, more to himself than to her. She would have liked that. The admission lingered in the cold air, fragile and unexpected. Then the boy spoke again. She told us to come here. The Duke's head snapped toward him. What? The boy didn't waver. We were walking, and I heard a voice. Not out loud, just in my head, I think. It said we should come here. That someone was waiting. The girl nodded quickly. She said not to be scared, she added. She said it would be okay. The Duke felt the world tilt again, his grip tightening on his cane as the words echoed too precisely, too familiarly to dismiss. He looked to the woman, expecting her to correct them, to laugh it off, but she didn't. Her expression had changed, the calm still there, but now threaded with something deeper, something unsettled. They've never said anything like that before, she said quietly. The Duke looked back at the children, at their unguarded certainty, and for the first time, he couldn't force logic over what he was hearing. Because those words, those exact words, had once belonged to his daughter, and now, impossibly, they had found their way back to him. The Duke stood there for a long moment, caught between disbelief and something far more dangerous, hope. And he had spent a lifetime learning that hope, when misplaced, could ruin a man faster than grief ever could. Yet as he looked at the children, at the quiet certainty in their eyes, he realized this was not something that could be dismissed with reason alone. What else did she say? He asked, his voice lower now, steadier, as if he were afraid the answer might disappear if he reached for it too quickly. The boy glanced at his sister, then back at the grave. Just one thing, he said. She said, tell him I kept my promise. The words hit harder than anything before them, stripping away whatever control the Duke had left. His knees gave out completely this time, the gravel biting through the fabric of his trousers as he sank down before the headstone, not caring who saw, not caring what it looked like, because that was her promise, the one she had whispered to him on a hospital bed he could barely stand to remember, the one he had carried like a weight ever since she was gone. I won't leave you alone, she had said, her small hand gripping his with surprising strength. And he had nodded, because fathers were supposed to be strong, supposed to believe in things like that, even when they knew better. But now those words had come back to him from the mouths of strangers, carried across a distance he did not understand, delivered in a way that felt too precise to deny. He bowed his head, a broken breath escaping him, and for the first time since her death, the grief he had locked away rose freely, unrestrained, not as something to be controlled, but as something to be felt. The woman said nothing, sensing that this moment did not belong to her, only resting a quiet hand on each child's shoulder as they stood beside him, unusually still, as if they understood they had completed something important. After a while, the Duke lifted his head, his composure not restored but changed, softened in a way that made him seem, for the first time, less like a title and more like a father. He reached out, almost hesitantly, and placed his hand over the small flower the girl had left at the base of the grave. Thank you, he said, not just to the children, but to whatever unseen thread had led them there. Then, after a pause, he added quietly, all of you. And though the morning remained cold, and the churchyard unchanged, something within him had shifted permanently. Not the loss, not the absence, but the certainty that it was absolute. As the children turned to leave with the woman, the boy glanced back one last time. She's not gone, you know, he said simply. The Duke watched them walk away, their figures growing smaller between the stones, and for the first time in 18 months, he did not feel alone in that silence.